It was a cold autumn night when three college friends, Ben, Sarah, and Jake, decided to venture into the Whispering Woods. The small town they lived in had its share of ghost stories, but none more terrifying than the tales about these woods. People said the trees whispered, not with the wind, but with the voices of the dead. No one who went in at night ever came out the same. Despite the warnings, the trio was determined to debunk the legends. Armed with flashlights and a bottle of cheap whiskey, they laughed off the idea of spirits. They parked the car at the edge of the forest and began their trek. The first hour was uneventful. They followed the winding dirt path deeper into the forest, joking and sharing stories about their childhood. But as the moon rose higher in the sky, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the woods became eerily silent. No animals, no wind, nothing, just stillness. Jake was the first to hear it. A soft murmur carried on the wind. He stopped, and the others noticed his change in demeanor. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered, his voice shaky. "No, it's just your imagination," Sarah said, though she too seemed unsettled. But then Ben heard it, faint, like someone calling his name from a distance. His flashlight flickered. Ben, Sarah, Jake. The voice was low, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Okay, this isn't funny," Ben said, spinning around, trying to locate the source of the sound. Suddenly, the woods came alive. The trees groaned as though bending under the weight of unseen forces, and whispers swirled around them, coming from all directions. Panic set in. The flashlight beams darted erratically through the dense woods, casting long, eerie shadows. "Let's get out of here," Sarah screamed, bolting back toward the car. The others followed, their breaths ragged as they raced through the darkness. But no matter how far they ran, the path kept winding deeper into the woods. It was as though the trees were shifting, moving, blocking their way out. Then they saw it, an old, decaying cabin in a small clearing. Desperate and exhausted, they ran inside, slamming the door behind them. The whispers outside grew louder, but inside, it was silent, too silent. "Maybe we can stay here until morning," Jake said, though his voice wavered with fear. The cabin was rotting from the inside out. The wooden floorboards creaked under their feet, and the air smelled of damp decay. There was a single wooden chair in the corner, facing the wall, as if someone had been sitting there, waiting. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered, backing away from the chair. Suddenly, the door they had come through swung open, slamming against the wall. The air grew cold, freezing, and the whispers flooded in again. But now they were clear. They were crying. Jake's flashlight flickered and went out. Sarah screamed as something brushed past her, invisible but unmistakably real. Ben tried to turn on his phone, but the battery, which had been at 70%, was completely dead. "Run!" Ben yelled, but when they turned, the door was gone. The cabin had transformed, now windowless, with walls that seemed to stretch, bending in unnatural angles. Suddenly, the chair turned by itself, and sitting in it was a man, or what had once been a man. His skin was pale and rotted, his eyes hollow and sunken, his mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, as if held open by invisible strings. Before they could scream, the man whispered, "Stay with me." Jake ran toward the wall in desperation, but it absorbed him like quicksand. His body twisted, melding with the wood as he screamed in agony, his face pressed into the timber, forever trapped. The cabin creaked, as if groaning with satisfaction. Sarah collapsed, weeping, as Ben tried to pull her to her feet. "We have to go. We have to go." But it was too late. The floorboards opened up beneath Sarah, and she fell into the blackness. Ben tried to hold onto her, but something cold and slimy wrapped around his wrist, pulling him in two. The whispers were deafening now, blending into screams. He could feel them crawling over his skin, scratching at his mind. Ben awoke, gasping for air, in the middle of the woods, alone. The sky was dark, but the cabin was gone. He staggered back to the car, shaking, his heart pounding. But something was wrong. He couldn't remember his name. He couldn't remember who he was. When he looked in the rearview mirror, the reflection wasn't his. It was the man from the cabin, grinning back at him, a part of him now. And then, just as he realized what had happened, he heard the voices again, calling him, begging him to come back to the cabin. Because he was next. The worst part? No one would ever find the bodies of Sarah or Jake, and every night, the woods would call out to someone new, trapping them, piece by piece, until the cabin had taken all of them. No escape, no mercy, just whispers in the dark, forever. Ben couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His reflection, that awful grinning face, still haunted him, and the cabin's whispers echoed in his mind. He drove back to town, but the sense of relief he expected never came. He couldn't remember his past, who he was, or how he had ended up in the woods. And worse, there was an emptiness in his chest, a hollow feeling that grew with every passing moment. He tried to tell people what had happened, but they didn't believe him. His friends, Sarah and Jake, they had never existed, at least, not according to anyone he asked. When he visited their apartments, they were empty. The landlord claimed no one by those names had ever lived there. His phone was blank, no contacts, no photos, no texts, like they had been wiped clean from his life. He was alone. Ben's paranoia grew. Every night, he heard the whispers again, louder and closer. Sometimes, he'd wake up in the middle of the night to see shadowy figures standing at the edge of his room, always just out of sight, their murmurs filling the air. He felt them watching him, waiting. Then one night, Ben decided to return to the Whispering Woods, hoping to find answers. He couldn't stand it anymore, the sleepless nights, the whispers, the feeling that something was rotting inside him. The forest had taken something from him, and he needed it back. It was a foggy night when he parked his car at the edge of the woods, the same spot they had parked weeks ago. The entrance loomed before him, the trees twisting unnaturally in the mist, beckoning him in. He hesitated but knew there was no turning back. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. The woods were alive again, even more oppressive than before. The whispers surrounded him immediately, not just from the trees but from the ground, the sky, everywhere. He trudged forward, his flashlight flickering, but this time, he didn't try to run. He let the voices guide him deeper, his footsteps steady as though some unseen force was pulling him along. Finally, he reached the clearing. The cabin stood there, darker, more menacing. The front door creaked open slowly, as if inviting him inside. He could feel the pull, the magnetic lure of the place. A voice, faint and familiar, came from within. Ben. It was Sarah's voice. "Sarah," he shouted, rushing forward. He stumbled inside, and the door slammed shut behind him. The inside of the cabin was as twisted as his memories, walls bending, floorboards creaking under invisible weight. In the corner, the chair stood facing the wall again, but this time, something was different. The chair was occupied. Slowly, it turned, revealing Sarah, or what was left of her. Her skin was ashen, her eyes vacant, and her mouth hung open in a grotesque smile, just like the man he had seen before. Jake was there too, his body half fused with the wall, his face distorted in eternal agony, frozen in a scream. "Ben," Sarah croaked. Her voice was hollow, echoing from deep inside her throat. "You should have left us." His breath caught in his throat, panic rising. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen." He backed away, stumbling over debris on the floor. But then, he heard it, that low, rumbling laugh, the same inhuman sound that had haunted him ever since that night. The man in the chair from before, the one who had grinned at him in the mirror, stood up from the shadows of the cabin. He was taller now, more twisted, his limbs stretching unnaturally long. His smile was still frozen, but his eyes gleamed with a sickening hunger. "You came back," the man said in a voice like shattered glass. "You never leave the Whispering Woods. You belong to me now." Ben turned to run, but the walls of the cabin were closing in on him. He screamed, banging his fists against the door, but it didn't budge. The floorboards began to split open beneath him, and from the cracks, dark, skeletal hands reached out, grabbing at his legs, pulling him down. "Ben, help me," Sarah's voice whispered one last time before she faded into the blackness. The hands tightened their grip. The cabin itself seemed to breathe, the wood shifting and groaning as if it were alive. Hungry, Ben fought desperately, clawing at the walls, but the hands were too strong. His legs were swallowed by the floor, then his waist. His heart raced as he felt the cold, bony fingers reaching up to his chest. His final scream was drowned out by the whispers, now louder than ever, echoing in his mind, driving him mad. And then, the man stepped forward, placing one twisted hand on Ben's face. His fingers were sharp, like talons, and his smile never wavered. "You're one of us now," the man whispered, leaning in closer, his breath cold as death. "Welcome home." And with that, Ben was pulled into the floor, into the very wood of the cabin, his body twisted and consumed by the dark. The cabin was still again. The next morning, a local ranger found Ben's abandoned car at the edge of the woods. There was no sign of him or his friends. Just as with every other soul that had entered the Whispering Woods, the ranger shook his head and radioed in the disappearance. He didn't even bother going into the forest. He knew better than that. But what he didn't know was that every night from that day forward, 3 new voices could be heard among the whispers: Ben, Sarah, and Jake, trapped, forever calling out to anyone foolish enough to enter the woods, hoping someone would hear them. But no one ever did. The cabin was always hungry, and it would never stop feeding. Years passed, and the legend of the Whispering Woods grew even darker. Ben, Sarah, and Jake became just 3 more names added to the growing list of those who had vanished within the forest's grasp. But there was always someone new, always someone brave or foolish enough to try their luck. Lily had heard the stories all her life. Growing up in the nearby town, she knew better than to venture into those cursed woods. But she was desperate. Her younger brother, Thomas, had disappeared 2 days ago, and she was convinced he had been dared to enter the Whispering Woods. He was just a kid, barely 12. Lily couldn't let him become another ghost in the long list of tragedies. She packed a flashlight, a knife, and her phone. Unlike the others, she wasn't going in blind. She had read every scrap of lore about the Whispering Woods, talked to locals, even visited the families of the lost, and the one thing they all said was the same: don't follow the whispers. But tonight, as Lily stood at the edge of the forest, the dense trees swallowing the moonlight, she felt a sinking dread deep in her bones. She called Thomas's name into the thick darkness, but the only answer was the rustle of leaves in the cold wind. Steeling herself, she stepped forward, her flashlight cutting through the mist. The forest was dense and silent, eerily so. It felt wrong, unnatural. Her footsteps were muffled by the damp earth, and the trees seemed to lean toward her, as if watching her every move. As she ventured deeper, the fog thickened, and the path became harder to follow. Then it began, the whispers. At first, they were faint, like distant voices just beyond her reach. She froze, her heart pounding. Every instinct screamed for her to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But she pressed on, calling her brother's name into the darkness. "Thomas," she cried. "Thomas, can you hear me?" A whisper answered, soft and haunting, "Lily." Her blood turned to ice. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was Thomas. "Thomas," she yelled again, louder now, running toward the sound. "Where are you?" The whispers grew louder, guiding her deeper into the woods, further from the safety of the road. The trees seemed to close in around her, but she didn't care. All she could think about was finding her brother. Then she saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. It wasn't a flashlight. It was too dim, too unnatural, but she followed it anyway, her heart racing. The light led her to a clearing, and there, in the middle, stood the cabin. It was smaller than she expected, its wooden frame decayed and rotting, the windows covered in grime. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside came the whispers, louder now, like 100 voices speaking all at once. "Thomas," she called, stepping toward the cabin. "Lily." The voice was right behind her now. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door. She hesitated, the cold grip of fear wrapping around her chest. But she couldn't leave. She couldn't abandon Thomas. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The inside of the cabin was worse than she imagined. The walls were warped, the air thick with the stench of rot and decay. The floor creaked under her weight, and shadows seemed to dance along the walls, their movements unnaturally fluid. In the corner, the same chair stood facing the wall, just as the stories had said. "Thomas," she whispered, stepping further inside. The whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating. Then, slowly, the chair began to turn. Lily's breath caught in her throat as the chair completed its rotation. But it wasn't her brother sitting there. It was something else, something that looked like him. His skin was pale, his eyes hollow, and his mouth hung open in a twisted, grotesque smile. He looked at her, but it wasn't Thomas behind those eyes. It was something far older, something far more sinister. "Lily," the thing croaked, its voice hollow and distorted. "You shouldn't have come." "No," she screamed, stumbling back. "No, you're not him." The thing stood, its movements slow and jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen hands. "You're too late, Lily. He's ours now. You'll never find him." Desperation overwhelmed her. She turned to flee, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crack. The walls began to shift, bending and warping as the cabin itself seemed to come alive. From the floor, dark, skeletal hands reached up, clawing at her legs, trying to pull her down. She slashed at them with her knife, but more hands appeared, dragging her toward the center of the room. The whispers returned, louder now, deafening, as the cabin groaned under the weight of the spirits trapped within. Lily screamed, fighting against the hands, but it was no use. They were too strong. She was pulled to the floor, her body sinking into the rotting wood. The last thing she saw was the thing wearing her brother's face, grinning down at her. The whispers consumed her. The next day, a search party was sent out to find Lily. Her car was found at the edge of the Whispering Woods, but there was no sign of her. Just like Ben, Sarah, Jake, and the countless others before them, she was gone, swallowed by the forest, just another lost soul in the endless hunger of the Whispering Woods. But the whispers never stopped. They would always be there, calling out, luring in the next victim, because the cabin was always hungry, and no one could escape its grasp. Lily's voice joined the chorus, forever trapped, forever calling for help that would never come. And so the woods waited, as they always did, because someone else would come. Someone always did.